There's a single moment almost every trader eventually reaches. Not a moment of losing money, though it usually shows up wrapped around a loss. A moment where every explanation you've been using finally runs out at the same time, and you're left staring at the results with nothing left to blame. 90% of people who hit this exact moment quit within weeks of it. The other 10%, hitting the identical moment, use it as the actual turning point of their entire trading career. Same moment, two completely different doors. Today, I want to show you what that moment actually is, why it splits people so cleanly, and what determines which door you walk through. My name's Tom. What I'm about to describe isn't a formal study. I want to be upfront about that from the start. It's a pattern I've pieced together from watching how traders actually behave at their lowest points, and from conversations about exactly what was going through their heads right before they either walked away for good or genuinely turned things around. I've built composite examples to make it concrete, because the pattern itself matters more than any single anecdote, and I think once I describe it, most of you will recognize it immediately, whether you've already passed through it or you're circling it right now. Here's the assumption almost every trading video makes about why people quit, and it's the assumption I want to challenge directly. The story is usually someone blows an account, gets emotionally overwhelmed, and gives up because they can't handle the financial pain. That happens, sure, but it's not actually the moment I'm talking about, and it's not the moment that determines who transforms and who leaves. The real breaking point is quieter than that, and it usually arrives after the big dramatic loss, not during it. Let me walk you through what I mean using a composite trader I'll call Jake. Jake blew his first account 8 months into trading. Painful, but not the breaking point, because Jake still had a story ready. Bad broker execution, unusually volatile month, a strategy that needed more testing. That story got him back in, and honestly, it wasn't even unreasonable. Sometimes execution really is bad. Sometimes a month really is unusually volatile. He blew a second account 4 months later. Still had a story. Different one this time. Maybe he'd been trading a size too large for the account. Maybe the strategy worked, but needed a longer time frame. Still plausible. Still got him back in. It's worth pausing here, because I don't want to make it sound like these early stories were pure self-deception. They usually aren't. Execution genuinely does vary between brokers. Strategies genuinely do need more sample size than a few months provides. The early stages of anyone's trading history are full of real, legitimate variables that really can explain a bad stretch. That's exactly what makes them so easy to lean on, and exactly why leaning on them isn't the mistake people assume it is. The mistake, if there is one, is only in never getting around to actually testing and eliminating each story once it's been used, which is a very different problem than simply having stories in the first place. The third account is where something different happened, and this is the moment I actually want to focus on, because this is the breaking point, not the blown accounts themselves. Jake sat down to figure out what went wrong this time, reached for a story the way he had twice before, and for the first time, nothing fit. He'd controlled his size this time. Execution had been fine. The strategy had actually worked on paper. In backtesting, dozens of times. And it had still lost in a way that had nothing external left to point at. That's the moment. Not the loss. The moment right after it, when every external explanation runs out at the same time, and the only variable left standing in the room is the trader himself, looking back at his own decisions with nowhere left to point the camera except inward. I call this attribution collapse, and I think it's the single most important, least discussed moment in the entire arc of a trading career. It's the point where the stories that protected you, the ones that let you get back in the chair after every previous setback, simply stop being available. Not because you ran out of creativity, because you've genuinely controlled for the things those stories used to blame and the results still didn't hold up. I think it's worth naming why this term, attribution, is actually the right word here, rather than just calling it a bad week or a rough patch. Attribution is a specific psychological process, the way any of us explain why an outcome happened. Humans do this constantly and mostly unconsciously for everything, not just trading. When your car won't start, you attribute it to the battery or the cold weather, or a part wearing out, rarely to some flaw in your character, that's a healthy, ordinary way to process an ordinary setback. Trading results get attributed the exact same way at first, to the broker, to the market conditions, to the specific strategy variant. What makes attribution collapse different is that it's the point where every one of those ordinary, healthy explanations has already been tested and used up. And the only remaining candidate for attribution is the one place most people never want to look: their own ongoing decisions, not as a single mistake, but as a pattern. Here's why this single moment splits people so cleanly into quitting and transforming. And it comes down to what attribution collapse actually feels like from the inside. When your explanations run out, the only thing left to explain the result is you. Your judgment, your process, your decision-making, sitting there exposed with nothing left to hide behind. For most people, that feels less like useful information and more like a verdict on who they are as a person. And a verdict like that, delivered all at once with no more stories left to soften it, is exactly the kind of moment that makes someone want to leave the room entirely rather than sit with it. That's door one, the 90% door. Not because these people are weaker or less committed than the 10% who transform, because attribution collapse experienced as a verdict on identity is genuinely unbearable to sit inside for very long. And walking away is a completely rational response to something that feels unbearable. Door 2 exists because of a subtle but total reframe of the exact same moment. And this is the part I think almost nobody teaches directly, because it sounds almost too simple to be the actual hinge point of something this significant. The traders who transform at this moment aren't experiencing a different collapse than the ones who quit. They're interpreting the identical collapse through a different lens. Not, this result is a verdict on who I am, but this result is finally isolated data about what I'm actually doing now that everything else has been ruled out. Notice what changed there. Nothing about the external facts of the situation. The account is still gone. The strategy still failed under real, controlled conditions. What changed is whether the trader experiences that as evidence about their worth or as evidence about their process. Those two framings produce completely different next actions, even though they're both responding to the exact same underlying event. Let me give you a second composite, a trader I'll call Elena, who hit an almost identical version of this same moment. Same setup, roughly. A blown account where every external story had already been used up on previous attempts, and this time, nothing external was left to blame. Elena sat with that for what she described as several genuinely uncomfortable days. But somewhere in there, the question she kept returning to wasn't, what does this say about me? It was, what does this say about my process, specifically, right now, that I couldn't see before because I always had something else to point at? That reframe let her do something Jake, in his first pass through this moment, couldn't do at all. Actually examine her own decisions with something closer to curiosity than shame. She went back through her trades from that account, not looking for a new external explanation, but looking for the first time at her own behavior as the actual object of study. What she found wasn't a new strategy flaw. It was a pattern in how she'd been sizing positions after a couple of wins in a row, quietly increasing size without ever writing that decision down, as a rule. Purely on a feeling of being on a roll. Nothing external had caused her recent blow-up. A completely internal, previously invisible habit had, and attribution collapse was the only thing that had ever forced her to look directly at it, because it was the first time she had nothing else left to blame. Here's what I think is the actual mechanism underneath why this moment is universal, and why it always eventually arrives no matter how good someone's early external stories are. Every plausible external explanation has a shelf life, because eventually you either fix that specific external problem or you control for it directly. Bad broker execution gets solved by switching brokers. A strategy needing more testing gets solved eventually by actually testing it enough. Trading too large for the account gets solved by trading appropriately sized. Each external story, if you actually take it seriously and act on it, eventually gets used up, because you fixed the thing it was pointing at. This means attribution collapse isn't a sign that something has gone unusually wrong for you specifically. It's what happens Structurally, once you've taken your own excuses seriously enough to eliminate them one at a time. In a strange way, reaching this moment is actually a sign you've been doing something right along the way, methodically ruling out the external variables, even though it doesn't feel that way at all when you're sitting inside it. The traders who never reach this moment usually aren't the lucky ones. They're the ones who keep generating new external stories faster than they eliminate the old ones, which keeps them protected from this moment indefinitely at the cost of never actually improving. So if attribution collapse is coming for basically everyone who takes this seriously long enough, the real question isn't how to avoid it. It's how to walk through door 2 instead of door 1 when it arrives. And I think there are 3 specific things that make that reframe possible, rather than it just being random luck of temperament. The first is having something concrete to look at the moment the collapse happens, rather than being left alone with just the feeling of it. Elena had her actual trade history to go back through. Jake, on his first pass, didn't have anything nearly as specific, just a general sense that things had gone wrong again, with no concrete record detailed enough to actually investigate. The difference between "I failed" as a vague, total feeling and "here's the specific decision on the 11th of the month that doesn't match my own stated rules" as a concrete, isolated fact is enormous. One of those is an identity wound. The other is a fixable data point. Keeping detailed enough records before you ever reach this moment is what determines whether you have a data point waiting for you or just a feeling. The second is having any exposure at all, beforehand, to the idea that this moment exists and is normal. This is part of why I'm making this video, honestly. Most trading education never mentions attribution collapse as a specific expected event. It treats every setback as its own isolated crisis. So when the moment where all your stories run out simultaneously actually arrives, it feels unprecedented and uniquely damning, rather than feeling like exactly what it is. A well-worn, common juncture that most serious traders eventually reach. Simply knowing in advance that this is a known fork, that plenty of people have stood exactly where you're standing, and some of them walked through to the other side, changes how survivable the moment feels when you're actually inside it. There's a useful comparison here to how people talk about other difficult, well-mapped transitions in life, the kind where forewarning genuinely changes the experience of going through them. Someone who's been told in advance that a certain stage of a difficult process is common, temporary, and survivable tends to experience that stage very differently from someone hit with it completely unprepared. Even though the underlying event is identical in both cases, attribution collapse works the same way. The event itself doesn't change based on what you knew beforehand. How survivable it feels absolutely does. The third is the presence of even one other person to talk to during it, someone who won't either dismiss what you're feeling or amplify it into something bigger than it is. Jake described his first pass through this moment as almost entirely solitary, sitting with the collapse alone for days before eventually deciding to just stop trading altogether. When he eventually came back to it, a while later, the difference wasn't a new strategy. It was one conversation with someone who'd been through their own version of this exact moment, who reflected back to him, in plain terms, that what he was experiencing was data about a decision, not a verdict on his character. That single reframe, delivered by someone outside his own head, was enough to move him from door 1 back toward door 2. It's worth being honest about why this third factor matters as much as it does. Inside attribution collapse, you're trying to reinterpret an experience using the exact same mind that's currently convinced the experience is a verdict on your worth. That's an enormously difficult thing to do alone, not because you lack insight, but because the interpretation and the thing being interpreted are both happening inside the same overwhelmed system at the same time. An outside voice isn't magic. It's simply a second system, one that isn't currently flooded by the collapse itself, capable of offering the reframe that your own flooded system genuinely cannot generate on its own in that moment. I want to be direct about the identity shift buried inside all of this, because I think it's the actual heart of the whole pattern. The traders who transform at this moment aren't the ones with thicker skin or more raw resilience or some inborn toughness the other 90% lack. They're the ones who, in that specific moment, manage to relocate the collapse from a statement about who they are to a statement about what they did. That relocation is learnable. It's not a fixed trait you either have or don't. It's closer to a skill, one you can practice and prepare for before the moment ever arrives. The same way you'd prepare a stop loss before you're inside a live trade, rather than trying to invent good judgment in the middle of watching a number move against you. This reframes something people get wrong constantly about the traders who do eventually make it. They assume the 10% who transform must have gone through less pain or hit a smaller version of the collapse, or simply have a personality better suited to this. In the composites I've described here, that's not what separated Jake from Elena, or even separated Jake's first pass through this moment from his second one. The collapse itself was comparably intense in every version. What differed was entirely in the conditions surrounding it. What records existed to investigate, what they already understood about the moment going in, and who was or wasn't in the room with them while it happened. None of those three conditions require a different personality. They require preparation done in advance by a calmer version of the same person who will eventually need it. Here's the boring, unglamorous version of what preparing for this actually looks like. Because I don't want to leave this as some abstract insight without a concrete action attached to it. Keep records detailed enough that a future version of you, standing inside attribution collapse, has something specific to investigate instead of just a feeling to sit with. Know right now, before you ever need it, that this moment is common and survivable, and that reaching it is closer to evidence you've been serious about this than evidence you're failing at it. And find, before you need it, at least one person who understands this specific moment well enough to reflect your situation back to you as data rather than as a verdict. Because trying to make that reframe alone, for the first time, in the middle of the collapse itself, is a much harder task than making it with even one outside voice in the room. Jake, on his second real attempt, hit a smaller version of this same moment about 5 months in. This time, he had a detailed log to go back through. He already knew roughly what this feeling was and that it had a name, and he had one person he could talk it through with. He found, in that log, a specific pattern in how he handled trades. Right after a losing streak, tightening his stops far more aggressively than his own written rules called for, purely out of a defensive feeling that had never once been written down as an actual rule. That single, specific, fixable pattern is what changed for him going forward. Not a new strategy, not more indicators. One decision isolated and named, because this time the collapse had somewhere concrete to land. Elena is still trading. Her account isn't dramatic. It's the same quiet, unremarkable line most transformed traders end up with. Nothing that would make for an exciting thumbnail. But she'll tell you directly that the exact week her old account finally died, with no stories left to explain it, is the week she actually became a trader. Not the week she started, and not any of the weeks in between where she still had somewhere else to point the blame. It's worth sitting with how strange that claim actually is. If you take it seriously, not the week she opened her first account. Not the week she found a strategy she believed in. The week everything fell apart with nothing left to blame is the week she marks in her own account of it as the real beginning. That's not a coincidence, and it's not sentimentality. It's the natural result of a moment that forces a level of honest self-examination no earlier point in a trading journey ever quite requires, precisely because there was always something else available to look at instead. So here's the actual question worth sitting with. Whether you've already been through this moment, you're circling it right now, or it's still somewhere ahead of you. When every explanation you've been leaning on finally runs out at the same time and there's nothing left standing in the room except your own decisions, will that feel like a verdict on who you are? Or will it feel like the first real data you've ever gotten about what you're actually doing?